The winter wind howled across the frozen plains as the small train finally reached the remote settlement. Snow covered the wooden rooftops, the narrow roads, and the bare branches of the surrounding trees. Most people had already gone inside, seeking warmth beside their fireplaces. Nobody expected a stranger to arrive that evening, especially not someone like Elara. She stepped down from the train slowly. Her clothes were torn and badly worn. A thin brown shawl hung around her shoulders, doing little to protect her from the bitter cold. Her boots were cracked, and one of them had been repaired with a strip of leather. In one hand, she carried a small cloth bundle containing everything she still owned. Elara was an orc woman. Her greenish-gray skin, strong build, small curved tusks, and pointed ears immediately drew attention from the few people standing near the station. Conversation stopped as she walked past. Some stared openly. Others whispered behind their hands. Elara kept her eyes lowered. She had learned long ago that people often judged her before she spoke. In her pocket was a folded letter. The letter had brought her here. It was an advertisement for a mail-order marriage. A man named Elias had supposedly been searching for a wife willing to live in a quiet frontier settlement. Elara had answered because she had nowhere else to go. Her life had been filled with rejection, hunger, and loneliness. She had hoped that perhaps this man would offer her a chance to begin again. But as she looked around the cold settlement, doubt filled her heart. What if he changed his mind when he saw her? What if he sent her away? She almost turned around. Then she saw him. A tall Apache man stood beside a dark wooden wagon near the station. His name was Elias. He wore a heavy coat and a wide-brimmed hat, and his face was serious and tired. Two little girls stood beside him, both wrapped in thick blankets. Elias had expected a woman to arrive. But he had not expected Elara. The moment he saw her, confusion crossed his face. Elara stopped several steps away. "Are you Elias?" she asked quietly. "Yes," he answered. Her fingers tightened around the cloth bundle. "I am Elara. I came because of the letter." Elias stared at her. Before he could respond, the older girl looked up at her father. "Papa," she whispered, "is she the bride?" Elias's expression immediately hardened. "Rose, go back to the wagon." But the younger girl continued staring at Elara. Her name was Mara. Unlike the adults around her, Mara did not look frightened or disgusted. She simply looked curious. Elara's torn clothes did not matter to her. Neither did her tusks or unusual appearance. Mara stepped closer. Elara instinctively lowered herself to the child's height. "Hello," she said gently. The little girl smiled. That tiny smile nearly broke Elara's heart. She had traveled so far expecting a husband she had never met. Instead, she had found two lonely children standing in the snow. Then Elias finally spoke. "There has been a mistake." Elara's heart sank. "A mistake? I never sent for a wife." Silence fell between them. Elara slowly unfolded the letter in her hand. "But this advertisement carried your name." Elias looked at the paper, then at his daughters. His face changed. He suddenly understood. The advertisement had not been written by him. It had been written by someone else. By one of his children. Before Elias could ask which one, Mara quietly reached for Elara's hand. Her small fingers wrapped around the orc woman's cold hand. Then she looked up with innocent, desperate eyes. "Please," Mara whispered. Elara stared at her. The little girl swallowed nervously. "Please be our mama." For the first time in years, Elara felt something warmer than hope. She felt needed. And standing in the freezing snow, surrounded by strangers who did not want her, she realized that perhaps this strange journey had brought her exactly where she was meant to be, : writing, variant equals, document, ID equals, 74126, ## part 2, a home she never expected. Elara could not answer Mara immediately. The little girl's hand remained wrapped around hers, small and trembling against the orc woman's rough fingers. Snow continued falling around them, covering Elara's worn boots and the shoulders of her thin shawl. "Please be our mama," Mara repeated softly. Elara looked into the child's eyes. There was something in that expression that frightened her more than rejection ever had. Hope. Elara knew what hope could do to a person. It could make someone believe in a future that might never come. It could make disappointment hurt twice as much. She gently squeezed Mara's hand. "I don't know if I can be your mama," she whispered. Mara's smile disappeared. "But perhaps," Elara continued, "I can be your friend." The girl nodded slowly. Elias watched the exchange in silence. His face remained tense, but something had changed in his eyes. He had expected Elara to become angry after learning the truth. He had expected her to demand an explanation and leave the moment she discovered that the marriage arrangement had been a mistake. Instead, she was thinking about his daughters. That made him uncomfortable. "Come," Elias finally said. "It's too cold to stand here." Elara followed him toward the wagon. The journey to Elias's home took nearly an hour. The cabin stood at the edge of the settlement, far from the busiest streets. It was small, but sturdy, surrounded by tall pine trees and a wooden fence that had seen better days. When Elara entered, she immediately noticed how little there was. 2 beds stood against one wall. A small table occupied the center of the room. A cold fireplace sat at the far end, and several empty shelves lined the walls. This was not the home of a wealthy man. It was the home of a tired man trying to raise 2 children alone. Elias placed another log into the fireplace. "Your room is there," he said, pointing toward a narrow space separated by a curtain. Elara looked inside. There was a small bed. Nothing else. She smiled faintly. "This is more than enough." Elias looked surprised. "You don't have to pretend." "I am not pretending." Elara placed her small bundle on the bed. She had spent nights sleeping beneath bridges and in abandoned barns. A bed, even a simple one, felt like luxury. That evening, Elias prepared dinner. It was a thin stew with potatoes and a small amount of meat. Elara noticed that Mara and Rose received the larger portions. Elias barely ate anything himself. Elara said nothing. The next morning, she woke before sunrise. The cabin was freezing. She found Elias asleep in a chair beside the fireplace, his coat still wrapped around him. Rose and Mara were sleeping peacefully. Elara quietly stood. She had no reason to stay. No marriage. No promise. No obligation. She could leave before anyone woke. But then she looked at the 2 girls. Mara's blanket had fallen to the floor. Elara walked over and gently covered her. Then she noticed the girl's dress. The fabric was torn near the shoulder. Elara frowned. She knew how to sew. By sunrise, the dress had been repaired. When Mara woke, she stared at the neat stitches. "Who fixed it?" Elara smiled. "I did." Mara immediately hugged her. Elara froze. Nobody had hugged her in years. Slowly, she placed one arm around the child. Across the room, Elias watched silently. Over the following days, Elara began helping around the cabin. She repaired clothing, cleaned the small home, gathered firewood, and learned how the family lived. She never demanded anything. She never complained. And little by little, the cabin began to change. There was warm food on the table. The girls laughed more often. The fireplace stayed lit. Even Elias seemed less burdened. But outside the cabin, people were talking. The settlement had noticed the strange family. An Apache widower. 2 daughters. and an orc woman who had arrived in rags claiming she was his bride. Some people laughed. Others whispered that Elara had come only for money. Elara heard them. She pretended not to care. But late one night, while sitting alone beside the fire, she touched the old scar on her wrist and remembered all the places where she had been unwanted. She had promised herself she would never depend on anyone again. Yet now, somehow, she was beginning to care about this family. And that frightened her. Because for the first time in her life, Elara had something she could lose. A home. A husband who was not yet hers. And two little girls who had already begun calling her family. She did not know it yet, but the greatest challenge was still waiting for her. Soon, Elias would discover exactly who had placed the mail-order advertisement. And when the truth finally came out, Elara would have to decide whether the love growing inside that little cabin was strong enough to survive the lie that had brought her there. Writing, variant equals, document, ID equals, 31467, ### part 3. The secret behind the letter. The truth began with a piece of paper. 3 weeks after Elara's arrival, Elias returned home earlier than usual. Snow had fallen heavily that afternoon, and the roads were almost impossible to travel. He stepped inside the cabin, removed his coat, and noticed a strange envelope lying on the table. It was addressed to him. Elias picked it up. The handwriting looked familiar. His eyes narrowed. He opened the envelope and pulled out a letter. At first, he thought it was another message from the settlement office. Then he read the first few lines. His face turned pale. It was a copy of the advertisement that had brought Elara to his door. Elias read it again. A strong, lonely man seeking a kind woman to become his wife. A home waiting for someone who could love two motherless children. His hands began to shake. He had never written those words. He had never placed an advertisement. And suddenly, he understood something that made his heart pound. Someone inside his home had done it. Elias looked toward the corner. Rose was sitting beside the window, sewing. Mara was playing with a wooden doll on the floor. Rose. The older girl froze. Yes, Papa. Come here. Rose slowly stood. Elias held up the letter. Did you write this? Rose's face went completely white. Silence filled the cabin. Mara stopped playing. Elara, who had been preparing dinner near the fireplace, turned around. Elias took one step forward. Rose, I asked you a question. The girl lowered her head. Yes. Elias stared at her. You sent for Elara? Rose's eyes filled with tears. I didn't mean for things to happen this way. Elias's voice became harsh. You lied to a stranger. You brought her hundreds of miles to a place she had never seen. You made her believe she was coming here to marry me. I know. Rose suddenly shouted. Then she covered her mouth. Tears rolled down her cheeks. I know I did something wrong. Elias stood silently. Rose looked at him through her tears. But you weren't going to do anything. Elias frowned. What does that mean? You were always alone, she whispered. You never smiled anymore. You came home tired. You sat by the fire and stared at Mama's old chair. The room became quiet. Elias looked away. Rose continued. And Mara and I were alone too. Mara lowered her head. Rose wiped her cheeks. We needed someone. Elias's anger weakened, but he was still hurt. You could have talked to me. I was scared. Scared of what? That you would say no. The word struck him harder than Rose could have known. Elara slowly put down the spoon in her hand. Rose turned toward her. I saw an advertisement for mail-order brides in an old newspaper. I thought if I wrote one for you, maybe someone would come. Elias closed his eyes. And you chose Elara? Rose nodded. I read about her. Elara looked surprised. You knew my name. I saw the letter you sent, Rose admitted. I knew you had nowhere to go. Elara's heart tightened. Rose stepped closer. I thought you might like us. Elara looked at the little girl. Rose's voice broke. I didn't know you would arrive with almost nothing. Elara looked down at her worn dress. For a moment, shame rose inside her. But then Rose reached for her hand. I don't care about your clothes. Elara looked at her. I don't care that you're an orc. The words were simple. But they carried more kindness than Elara had heard in years. I just wanted someone who wouldn't leave. Elara's heart broke. She suddenly understood why Mara had asked her to be their mother. The girls were not looking for a perfect woman. They were looking for someone who would stay. Elias turned toward Elara. I am sorry, he said. Elara looked at him. You didn't do this. But you came here because of me. I came because of a letter. And now? Elara did not answer. Elias swallowed. If you want to leave, I will take you to the station myself. The words hurt more than she expected. Elara looked around the cabin. At the repaired dresses. At the warm fire. At the two girls watching her anxiously. She had arrived expecting a husband. Instead, she had found something she had never dared to dream about. A family. But she could not ignore the truth. Everything had begun with a lie. That night, Elara packed her small cloth bundle. Mara cried when she saw it. Please don't go. Elara knelt beside her. I don't know what I should do. But you said you were our friend. I am. Then stay. Elara's eyes filled with tears. Mara leaned closer. Please be our mama. This time, the words were not whispered with hope. They were spoken with love. Elara looked toward Elias. The Apache man stood quietly near the fireplace. He did not ask her to stay. He did not try to stop her. He simply waited for her choice. And that was when Elara understood something important. For the first time in her life, someone was giving her the freedom to choose where she belonged. She slowly unfolded the clothes in her bundle. Then she placed them back on the bed. I'll stay, she whispered. Mara's face brightened. But only for now, Elara added. Elias nodded. That is enough. Elara smiled faintly. She did not know what the future held. She did not know whether she could ever become Elias's wife. She did not even know if the settlement would accept her. But that night, when Mara fell asleep beside her and Rose quietly sat near the fire, Elara realized that she had made her first choice freely. She had chosen to stay. And somewhere deep inside her heart, she already knew that leaving this family would soon become harder than she could ever imagine, writing, variant equals, document, ID equals, 92614, ##, part 4, the settlement turns against her. Winter grew harsher as the weeks passed. The snow around Elias's cabin reached nearly to the windows, and the cold wind swept across the settlement like a living thing. Inside the little cabin, however, there was warmth. Elara had become part of the family. Mara followed her everywhere. Rose, once quiet and suspicious of strangers, had begun telling Elara everything about her day. Even Elias had changed. He spoke more often now, sometimes laughing when the girls made mistakes at the dinner table. But outside their home, not everyone was happy. The people of the settlement had not forgotten that Elara was an orc. Some believed orcs were dangerous. Others believed she had tricked Elias into marrying her. The truth did not matter to them. They had already decided who she was. One afternoon, Elara walked into the general store to purchase flour. The moment she entered, the conversation stopped. She felt every eye turned toward her. Elara kept her head high. I need flour and salt, she said. The storekeeper hesitated. Then he placed the items on the counter. That will be $3. Elara reached into her pocket. Before she could pay, a man standing nearby laughed. Does the Apache know his new bride is spending his money? Elara froze. The man was named Harlan. He was one of the wealthiest ranchers in the settlement and had never hidden his hatred of outsiders. Elara looked at him. I am spending my own money. Harlan laughed again. You. His eyes moved over her worn clothes. You arrived here with nothing. Elara's jaw tightened. I arrived with very little. There is a difference. The store became silent. Harlan's smile disappeared. Elara paid for the supplies and walked out. She refused to let him see that his words had hurt. But when she returned home, Elias noticed immediately. What happened? Nothing. Elara. She looked at him. Your town doesn't want me here. Elias's expression hardened. This is your home. She shook her head. No. It is your home. Not anymore. The word surprised her. Elias stepped closer. You live here. You care for my daughters. You work beside me. You are part of this family. Elara looked away. I never asked for any of this. I know. And yet I stayed. Elias's voice softened. I know that too. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Mara ran into the room. Mama. Elara turned. The little girl immediately stopped. She looked embarrassed. Elara smiled. You can call me that. Mara's eyes widened. Really? Elara nodded. Mara rushed into her arms. Elias watched them. Something warm filled his chest. But the peace did not last. 2 nights later, someone attacked the cabin. A loud crash woke the family. Elara immediately sat up. Elias grabbed his rifle and moved toward the door. Stay here. Elara shook her head. I won't. Elara, I said I won't. Another crash came from outside. Then a window shattered. Mara screamed. Elara ran to the girls. Get down. Elias rushed outside. By the time he returned, the attackers were gone. The damage was terrible. The family's small food supply had been destroyed. Several sacks of grain had been stolen. The wooden fence had been broken. And someone had painted a cruel message across the front door. Go home, ORC. Elara stared at the words. Mara began crying. Elias immediately covered the message with his coat. Don't look at that. But Elara had already seen it. For years, she had heard people tell her that she did not belong. She had survived it. She had learned to ignore it. But now, seeing those words on the home she had begun to love, something inside her broke. Elias placed a hand on her shoulder. We will fix this. Elara looked at him. No, what? We will not just fix it. She walked toward the broken fence. We will rebuild everything. The next morning, Elara began working. She repaired the fence. She cleaned the shattered glass. She helped Elias rebuild the damaged wall. She even found a way to stretch the remaining food supplies until they could purchase more. People watched from a distance. They expected her to leave. She did not. Instead, she worked harder. Days passed. Then a powerful snowstorm struck. The settlement was trapped beneath heavy snow. One evening, a young boy failed to return home. His family searched desperately. The boy had been seen near the frozen river. Elias immediately joined the search party. Elara followed. You stay here, Elias ordered. No, Elara, this is dangerous. So is leaving a child alone in a storm. Elias knew he could not change her mind. Together, they entered the blizzard. The snow was so thick they could barely see. After nearly an hour, they found the boy. He had fallen into a shallow ditch and injured his leg. Elias tried to carry him. But the snow was too deep. Elara stepped forward. She lifted the child into her arms. The boy was terrified at first. Then he realized she was helping him. "Don't be afraid," Elara whispered. "I've got you." She carried him through the storm. When they finally reached the settlement, the boy's mother ran toward them. She hugged her son. Then she looked at Elara. For a moment, she said nothing. Finally, she whispered, "Thank you." It was only 2 words. But everyone heard them. The people who had once mocked Elara now watched her differently. She had arrived wearing rags. She had been called dangerous. She had been told she did not belong. Yet when the settlement needed someone brave enough to walk into a deadly storm, Elara had gone without hesitation. That night, Elias stood beside her outside the cabin. "You saved that boy." Elara looked at the stars. "He needed help." Elias smiled. "That is what you always say." She turned toward him. "What?" "That you are only helping." Elara frowned. Elias's smile grew. "But you do more than help." He looked toward the cabin, where his daughters were laughing. "You make people feel safe." Elara's heart skipped. She looked away. For the first time, she wondered if Elias saw her differently now. Not as the woman who had arrived because of a mistaken advertisement. Not as an unwanted orc. But as someone who truly belonged. And inside the little cabin, Mara whispered to Rose, "I told you Mama would stay." Rose smiled. Outside, Elara stood beside Elias as snow began falling again. She still did not know what the future would bring. But one thing was certain. She was no longer alone. And the settlement that had once wanted her gone was slowly beginning to realize that the woman they had rejected was becoming one of the strongest people among them. Writing, variant equals, document, ID equals, 41752, ### part 5. The choice at the wedding spring finally arrived. The snow melted from the rooftops, the frozen river began to move again, and small green plants appeared beneath the trees. After months of hardship, the settlement seemed to breathe once more. For Elara, the change was more than seasonal. She had changed too. The woman who had arrived in torn clothes, carrying a single bundle, was no longer the same person. Her clothes were still simple, but they were clean and carefully repaired. Her face no longer carried the same fear she had worn at the train station. Most importantly, she no longer felt like a stranger. People greeted her in the streets. The storekeeper no longer looked suspicious when she entered. The mother of the boy Elara had rescued during the blizzard often brought fresh bread to the cabin. Even Harlan, the rancher who had once insulted her, had stopped speaking against her. But there was one person whose feelings Elara could not understand. Elias. He had become closer to her over the past few months. They worked together. They laughed together. They raised the girls together. Sometimes, when their hands touched while repairing the fence, Elara felt a strange warmth in her chest. But she was afraid to give that feeling a name. Because she remembered how their story had begun. She had come to the settlement believing Elias had chosen her. Then she discovered that Rose had written the advertisement. Elara had stayed because of the girls. At least, that was what she told herself. One evening, Elias found Elara sitting outside the cabin. The sun was setting behind the mountains. "Can I sit with you?" he asked. Elara moved slightly. "Of course." Elias sat beside her. For several moments, neither spoke. Then Elias reached into his coat. Elara immediately noticed the small wooden box in his hand. Her heart began beating faster. "What is that?" Elias opened the box. Inside was a simple silver ring. Elara stared at it. Elias, I know what you're thinking. She looked at him. You think I am asking because of the girls? Elara's eyes lowered. Aren't you? No, the answer came immediately. Elias closed the box. When you first arrived, I thought this entire situation was a mistake. I thought you would leave as soon as you learned the truth. Elara smiled sadly. So did I. But you stayed. Because your daughters needed me. Elias shook his head. At first, maybe. Elara looked at him. Elias's voice softened. But. Then something changed. He took a breath. I began waiting for you to come home. Elara's eyes widened. I began looking forward to hearing you laugh with the girls. He smiled. I began thinking that a house without you would feel empty. Elara's eyes filled with tears. Elias, I love you. The words were simple. But to Elara, they felt impossible. She had spent her entire life being rejected. People had called her ugly. Dangerous. Unwanted. She had learned to expect doors to close whenever she approached them. Now, the man she had once believed would send her away was telling her that he loved her. Elias held out the ring. I am not asking you because Rose wrote that advertisement. He looked directly into her eyes. I am not asking because my daughters need a mother. His voice became stronger. I am asking because I need you. Elara could barely breathe. Elias continued. If you say no, I will accept it. He placed the ring in her hand. If you decide to leave, I will help you find a place where you can be happy. Elara stared at him. Why would you do that? Because I love you enough to let you choose. Those words broke through every wall around her heart. For the first time, Elara understood what made this proposal different. Elias was not asking her to repay him. He was not asking her to save his family. He was giving her something she had never been given before. A choice. Elara looked down at the ring. Then she heard footsteps. Rose and Mara appeared around the corner. Mara immediately gasped. Are you proposing? Elias's face turned red. Go inside. Rose laughed. But we want to know. Elara wiped away a tear. Mara ran toward her. Are you going to marry Papa? Elara looked at Elias. He waited. He did not answer for her. Elara slowly smiled. Yes. Mara screamed with happiness. Rose hugged Elara tightly. This time, Elara did not freeze. She wrapped both arms around the girl. You're really staying? Rose whispered. Elara kissed the top of her head. I am staying. The wedding took place a few weeks later. It was not grand. There were no expensive decorations. No wealthy guests. No elaborate feast. But the entire settlement came. People who had once doubted Elara now stood proudly beside her. When Elara walked toward Elias, she wore a simple white dress that Rose had helped repair and decorate with small flowers. Mara carried the rings. Rose stood beside Elara. As the ceremony began, Elara looked at Elias. She remembered the day she had arrived. She had stepped off the train wearing rags. She had believed she was coming to marry a stranger. She had been rejected before anyone even knew her. Yet somehow, that painful journey had led her here. To this man. To these children. To this family. When the ceremony ended, Mara ran into Elara's arms. Mama. Elara laughed through her tears. She finally understood. She had not come to this place looking for a family. She had come looking for a chance to survive. But love had found her anyway. And this time, when she said she was staying, it was not because she had nowhere else to go. It was because she had finally found somewhere she wanted to belong. Elias took her hand. Rose stood on one side. Mara stood on the other. Together, they walked home beneath the warm spring sunset. For the first time, Elara did not feel like an outsider. She was not the unwanted orc woman from the train station anymore. She was a wife. She was a mother. She was loved. And she had chosen this family just as surely as they had chosen her, : writing, variant equals, document, ID equals, 65284, ## part 6. The family they chose. A year had passed since the day Elara first stepped off the train. The settlement had changed. Or perhaps it was Elara who had changed the way people saw it. The woman who had once arrived in torn clothes was now known by everyone. Children greeted her when she walked through the streets. Neighbors stopped by the cabin with vegetables, bread, and stories. No one called her an outsider anymore. Elara had become part of the settlement. But the greatest change had happened inside the little cabin at the edge of the woods. It was no longer a lonely place. Flowers grew near the front door. The broken fence had been replaced. A new wooden table stood inside, built by Elias. And every evening, laughter filled the rooms. Mara had grown especially attached to Elara. She followed her everywhere. If Elara went to gather firewood, Mara came along. If Elara cooked dinner, Mara stood beside her. If Elara sat outside to sew, Mara brought her own little piece of cloth and pretended to help. Rose had changed too. She was no longer the frightened girl who had secretly written a marriage advertisement because she feared losing her family. Now she was confident and brave. But sometimes she still worried. One afternoon, Elara found Rose sitting quietly near the river. "What's wrong?" Elara asked. Rose looked up. "Nothing." Elara sat beside her. "That's what people say when something is wrong." Rose smiled faintly. After a moment, she whispered, "Do you ever regret coming here?" Elara looked at her. "Why would you ask that?" "Because you didn't choose us at first." Elara's heart tightened. Rose continued. "You came because of the letter. Then you stayed because of Mara." Elara reached for her hand. "That's not true anymore." Rose looked at her. Elara smiled. "When I first arrived, I didn't know any of you." She looked toward the cabin. "Then I met Mara." Rose smiled. "And then I met you." Elara squeezed her hand. "Then I met your father." Rose laughed. "He's difficult." Elara laughed too. "Sometimes." Rose looked at her seriously. "But now you could leave if you wanted." Elara nodded. "I could." "Would you?" Elara immediately shook her head. "No." Rose's eyes filled with tears. "Why?" Elara pulled her into a hug. "Because you are my daughter." Rose began crying. Elara held her tightly. "You were never something I was forced to accept." She kissed Rose's forehead. "You became my family because I chose you." Those words stayed with Rose. That evening, when they returned home, Mara came running toward them. "Mama!" Elara opened her arms. Mara jumped into them. Rose watched them with a smile. Elias stood by the doorway. He looked at his family. His family. The thought still amazed him. Once, he had believed his life would always be lonely. After losing his wife, he had devoted himself entirely to raising his daughters. He had stopped imagining a future for himself. Then an orc woman had arrived at his door wearing rags. And somehow, she had brought his home back to life. Later that night, Elias and Elara sat together beside the fireplace. The girls were asleep. The cabin was quiet. Elias reached for Elara's hand. "Do you remember your first night here?" Elara smiled. "I remember being terrified. I thought you were going to leave." "I almost did." Elias looked surprised. "Really?" Elara nodded. I packed my things. What stopped you? Elara looked toward the room where the girls were sleeping. Mara. Elias smiled. Of course. Elara shook her head. Not only Mara. She looked at him. You. Elias was silent. You gave me a choice, Elara continued. I had spent my whole life being told where I could go and where I couldn't belong. Her fingers tightened around his. But you let me choose. Elias leaned closer. That was the easiest choice I ever made. Elara smiled. A sudden knock came at the door. Both of them looked up. Elias stood. It is late. Another knock came. Elara followed him. When Elias opened the door, a young woman stood outside. She was exhausted. Her clothes were torn. She carried a small bundle. Elara immediately recognized the look in her eyes. Fear. Loneliness. Desperation. For a moment, Elara saw herself standing at that train station 1 year earlier. The stranger looked past Elias. Then she saw Elara. Her eyes widened. I'm sorry, the woman whispered. I didn't know where else to go. Elara stepped forward. You don't have to apologize. Elias glanced at his wife. He already knew what she was going to say. Elara opened the door wider. Come inside. The woman hesitated. Are you sure? Elara smiled. Yes. She looked toward the fireplace. We have a warm fire. Then she looked toward the kitchen. And there is enough food for one more person. The woman stepped inside. As Elara closed the door, she remembered the words written on her own door many months ago. Go home, ORC, she had once believed she had no home. Now she understood something. Home was not always the place where you were born. Sometimes, home was the place where someone opened the door and told you that you could stay. The next morning, sunlight filled the cabin. Mara woke first. She ran into the main room. Mama. Elara turned. What is it? Mara climbed into her arms. We're home. Elara smiled. Rose joined them. Elias stood nearby, watching his family. Elara looked around the room. At her daughters. At her husband. At the warm fire. At the home they had built together. She remembered the lonely woman who had stepped off the train carrying everything she owned in a single bundle. That woman had believed she was unwanted. She had believed she was going somewhere to beg for love. But she had been wrong. She had not needed to beg. She had only needed to find the people who would choose her. And now, surrounded by the family she had chosen with her whole heart, Elara finally understood the true meaning of belonging. She had arrived in rags. She had been rejected by strangers. She had been brought there by a mistake. But she had stayed because of love. And in the end, the unwanted orc bride had found something far more precious than the marriage she had originally expected. She had found a husband who loved her. 2 daughters who called her mama. And a home that would always have a place for her. Outside, the settlement came alive beneath the morning sun. Inside the little cabin, Mara held Elara's hand. Come on, Mama, she whispered. Elara smiled. Where are we going? Mara pointed toward the door. Home. Elara looked at Elias and Rose. Then she took Mara's hand. Together, the 4 of them stepped outside. And this time, when Elara looked toward the road that led away from the settlement, she felt no desire to leave. Because wherever life took them next, she knew one thing for certain. She would never be alone again.